2 weeks ago, remember we had Joe Colangelo from the Mechanics Union on, and he told us all about how New York City had the parade for the essential workers that got us through the pandemic and the shutdown, and they left the mechanics out of the parade. So this week, Joe published an editorial in the local newspapers about why did the city leave the mechanics out of the parade. Nothing would have continued to function without people to make all the vehicles runnable. We're all in the business of maintaining vehicles, and without maintenance, everything will cease to work sooner or later. And how did all the essential workers get to work? They took their vehicles, most of them, because even if they took the train or the bus, we needed mechanics to keep the buses running, right? And the city just ignored us. So Joe came on and he told us about the problem the union has attracting help, bringing people into the industry. And today we have, I guess, an expert on bringing people into the industry. Mark Ferner is with TechForce Foundation. TechForce has been with us many times, and Mark has an interesting history. He started out as a technician, and today he's an engineer. Mark, tell us about yourself. How did you become a technician?
Hey, good morning. Well, actually, way back in high school, I went to high school in the morning, and I went to vocational school in the afternoon to learn auto mechanics. Had every intention of being a technician. I graduated high school. I started working as a tech, and the local community college offered me a free scholarship for 2 years based on my academics in high school. So at first, I was going to decline it. I planned on working as a tech. And my parents reminded me that I was still living at home and convinced me that I should at least give it a try part-time, keep my options open. I chose mechanical engineering because it had the word mechanic in it. No lie.
Me too.
And it turns out I loved wrenching, but at the same time, I was also curious about, how things worked and how they came up with different designs, and I just kind of went with it. And graduated as a mechanical engineer, and then I got pulled into the oil and gas industry, working for a few different oil companies. And as they started to find out that I had mechanical aptitude, these oil and gas things, I started out teaching people how to, people that own gas stations, I was teaching them the basics of fuels and lubricants and how they work and what were some of the myths that were out there.
But we'll want to pick your brain a little later about
Yeah.
the importance of lubrication. But finish your story about how you got into the business and all the things you've done.
Oh, no, no worries, no worries. And then I started getting involved in more on the lubricant side. And for a brief time, they had me working as a chemist making gear oils and transmission fluids. And then the tipping point for me, one day they contacted me and said, "Hey, we sponsor this NHRA team, and they're having issues with their differential. Nobody else knows what they're talking about. Do you think you can help them out?" And I spoke to the crew chief. I ended up flying to an NHRA track and being there right, while they're tearing down this top fuel dragster in between races, and quickly found out that they were trying to add additional additives to make things better, but it was actually making things worse and fix the problem. And from there, they started the company I worked for kept pumping me to work with other race teams, and soon I started working with NASCAR teams and sprint car teams, other drag race teams, and so that kind of took me down another path. And then I used to work for Shell Oil Company, and they have a lab that does nothing but dynamometer testing on fuels and lubricants. So you had, all of these dynamometers where you take the engine out, you put on a computer stand, transmissions, full driveline, engine, transmission, differentials with dynamometers hooked up throughout. And they sent me to eventually lead that lab in Hamburg, Germany. So I got to live overseas for a few years learning engine and vehicle testing lab, which was, kind of a pipe dream. It was just wonderful. And most recently, I worked for Bridgestone, Firestone, and kind of back on the side more around working with cars, look at shop equipment for all of our stores, look at training material for our stores, trying to keep our techs up to speed on what's coming up with autonomous vehicles, ADAS, EV hybrids, things like that. So just, started as a tech, always kept my roots with the tech, but been able to leverage that in a lot of different ways in other industries. And, I've had a lot of fun doing it.
Now, you cannot be in your business without being a car guy, can you?
Oh, I'm a car guy. I can
Okay.
tell you, I have a lift in my house garage. I'm in between project cars right now, but yeah, I still
So,
enjoy renting. I still keep up on my ASE certifications. So yeah, I'm still deep in it.
but what kind of cars do you have?
I'm in between project cars. I prefer the older muscle cars. My last project was a '72 El Camino that had a Stroker 383 in it and lots of upgrades. Um, Searching for my next one. My daily driver right now is a Gladiator. Doing a few mods to it, but nothing too extreme.
So we want to get back to talking about training new technicians and all the educational opportunities and job opportunities that are out there for anybody today who wants to
Yeah.
get into this business. The school systems. I talked earlier before you came on. I talked about the report we had 2 weeks ago from the president of the mechanics union, for all the mechanics that work for New York City, and he has trouble recruiting technicians. Everybody in this business has trouble recruiting technicians. I guess that's why TechForce was formed, right? Now you're also on the board of directors of TechForce today, right?
Correct. I'm brand new to the board, but yes, I'm on there. Yeah.
All right. So the editorial that Joe published talked about the city just disrespecting all the technicians and the importance of the work we do. The work we do is critical. No matter what, if you're working on cars or trains or planes or buses, um, everything in the world today and all the people in the world today move from one place to another, by things with wings and wheels, and it takes people to keep those machines running. Um, and today, the technology in those machines is so elaborate that you really have to be an engineer to fix these vehicles today. Since you're both a mechanic and an engineer, I think you would agree.
Oh, I definitely agree. I mean, just if you think about historically the staples of a brake job were, replacing pads and rotors or drums and tubes, and now you need to know all the other sensors and all the other things that work with that system. I mean, you could have a rain sensor on the dash that's slightly engaging the brakes to try to keep them dry, and that's causing an issue if it's malfunctioning with the brakes themselves. I mean, you have to know so much more about how the system works as a whole as opposed to just replacing parts.
That's why I tell my students I've been fixing cars for 65 years and I'm still going to school.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. It never stops. It never stops.
When you stop going to school, you're not going to be able to fix anything built after the 80s, right?
That's true. Technology just keeps marching on. I mean, it just keeps building on itself more and more and more. It, you're right. You're never going to stop learning about vehicles. No.
So
Also, with people driving, there's so many more opportunities though at the same time. Because as more and more new things and new technologies come up, there's new interest. There should be new interest in trying to fill that void as far as a job goes. With the people that want to get into this.
yeah, my pet peeve is with the education system. Particularly the high school systems, junior high schools, the teachers, the counselors, the administrators. They don't think what we do is important. And 50, 60 years ago, they tried to keep me out of shop class. I was born in the shop. I'm working in the shop since I'm 5 years old. And I always intended to go to college. My parents expected me to go to college, and I did too. but I wanted to take shop class, and the school tried to keep me out. But luckily, my parents backed me, and I took shop class and a full academic program. So the point I want to get across to everybody here today is that there are no limits to the opportunities for any kid to take shop class today. I mean, you took shop class and you went on to college, got a degree. I went on. I started out in college in mechanical engineering,
Okay.
and now I've been running a shop for decades and going back and taking more training, to get more and more certifications. So we sort of did things up in the opposite direction, but we wound up in the same place, both with degrees and lots of certifications.
Yeah.
But those opportunities, I say, open to any young person today who has the ability and the desire to learn as much as they want to learn, right?
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's important also to look at them as not being, two exclusive things. The overlap is so helpful because, again, just in my personal experience, some of the roles I've had in the oil and gas industry, they tapped me on the shoulder because I understood how cars work. And just because you're a chemist formulating engine oils or lubricants doesn't mean that you know how cars work. Being a mechanical engineer on itself doesn't mean you know how cars work. So having
And
that
then
hands-on experience, it ties it so well together. It makes you a unique asset so that you have the ability to speak and bridge across different things. And I'm sure it goes the other way too. Being a tech, if you understand the theory, then it makes it a lot easier to see how these technologies keep building on each other. I just think it's a win-win, and the overlap is so important.
So I think you would agree with another thing I tell my students. Engineers design things that break. Mechanics make them work and keep them working.
Yes, yes, I would agree with that. I would agree with that. And hey, I'm not saying that all engineering designs are perfect either. I've worked on enough cars where I can't believe that they put the starter in that location or the sway bar in that location. But hey, it is what it is.
We, we,
There's other factors.
we have specific technical curse words for those engineers, don't we?
Yeah. I have to be careful there and kind of dance off of both sides. So I got to.
Yeah. Well, that's why I wanted to have you on because you live in both sides. And I got out of engineering. I changed majors because I got involved in other things. But I still consider myself an engineer. I'm an engineer without math, you
All
know.
right.
So I do the engineering and then I get somebody else to do the math part.
Yeah, a big thing, like you said it before, Mark, that parents and guidance counselors and that whole department does not know where automotive technology fits. It's not just fixing cars, it's the overlay for a million other industries, whether it's insurance investigations, all over the place. And they don't give any credit to this is, steering a kid to this department because he doesn't like fans. We have students that come in our General Motors program and they are recruited by elevator companies to fix the elevators because the diagnostics are the same.
Yeah.
And they make a lot more money than people fixing cars.
It's a whole world of all different kinds of opportunities. And Mark, like you said it before, also opportunities that because you placed yourself in that position came your way. It's supposed to you having to try to find them. They found you and said, hey, look, we need a guy like you for the next thing. I mean, isn't that all people are looking for in careers? Nowadays, people go to college, they got all this debt going on, and they're trying to pound them pigs and trying to get a job. It doesn't, you hear this story all the time. And there's young people that get a real bad start with this college debt and everything, and they can't even find a job. And here we got all these job openings of all types. It's really just an opportunity that people don't know. And, it really just boils down to that. That people just don't know what's available to them, and that's why people should check these kinds of jobs out because the careers are there.
There's so many job opportunities in this industry at all levels, right? I mean, you're with Mark. You're with Bridgestone. You probably have dozens, hundreds of openings, don't you?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And this is what type of the job that you could take anywhere. You want to move to one state or another state, you could take that along with you. Like if you're in, say, the computers, let's say, you might have to go to a Silicon Valley type of area because it's really not, where you don't have that issue as a mechanic. You can take that anywhere. You go live in Alaska if you want to do and fix things.
Fix trucks in the oil fields.
Most auto technicians are never unemployed. They transition to another place without missing a beat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I tell anybody who wants to think about getting into this business, I said, if you're any good, you'll never be unemployed. If you're no good, you'll get fired, but you'll never get laid off if you're good. Right?
The education system itself needs to train these uh, the guidance counselors to make them aware that all this stuff is open to the children.
I tried to get a guidance counselor to come on today, but they're all afraid because they know that they're wrong what they're doing to keep kids out of trade education.
Yeah,
It's because they don't know enough about the trade
Exactly.
to actually give advice on it.
when we have high schools which are chaperoned by a guidance counselor or whoever the general teacher is or whoever, they leave our place amazed. They have no idea. You walk in and you
So now,
have no idea.
Mark Ivan teaches at community college in Jersey. I teach at community college here in New York City. We both have students that come in that probably found us by accident, right? Don't you, Ivan? I had a student at our school. He registered for a different program. He didn't even know the school had automotive.
Yep.
When he found
That's good.
right.
Program's been there for 40 years, and people go, I didn't know there was automotive here.
Right, and these are people that really
Doesn't know.
they really have a desire to be in our business, and the school doesn't even tell them that we have automotive.
Mike, would it
Yes.
not be a great idea that if TechForce and yourselves actively went into high schools and had a session, just contacted the head, said, we are this organization, we're very respected, we are very established, we would like to come into a school just on a drive, excuse the pun, to open the eyes to your students to this industry and where it can apply to so many areas. And you just go in and you have a session with them. And you pick a particular year group, and you can pick a particular topic, a particular subject, the day in the life of a tech, what it involves, what the job opportunities are. That, I think, would solve the problem. Why students don't seem to know.
And part of the problem is at the high school and junior high school level, there are almost no car guys running the system. You know, so they don't.
They all drive into, but all the lecturers and the teachers and everybody else drive in. So you can say to them, who keeps your cars going to get you into school? We do.
A General Motors conference, and there was a female engineer who was working for Pontiac at one point that came on to say there are tons of women that are car kids. They grew up around it. They want it, and it's in middle school that they're steered in other directions.
Yes, my granddaughter's 4 years old. She loves cars.
Yeah.
She's going to grow up to be a car girl.
They said you got to grab them in middle school before the school system starts changing.
Now, another thing, problem with the schools, where do they classify us? If you look at schools and try and find an automotive program, you can't find it. What department is it in? In our school, we're part of the engineering department, which is where we belong.
We're STEM.
What's that?
We're STEM. We're classified in STEM.
Okay.
When I was at Raritan Valley, it was in business.
Right. So we need our own category. The government has classified us in transportation. There is no category for mechanics. We need our own category as a subset of engineering. Don't you agree, Mark?
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Especially if you look at the technology that's required to work on the vehicles today. Absolutely.
So when the counselors talk to students about career opportunity, exploring different careers, there is no career listing for mechanics. Uh, we are part of transportation. We are lumped in with warehouse workers, tugboat workers, airport workers. We're all lumped in with the transportation industry. Anybody that moves goods or people, we're part of that industry. We are part of that industry, but we are such a specific technical aspect of that industry. We're more related to engineering than somebody moving pallets in a warehouse, right?
Hmm.
So I think we need our own separate technical category, and I hope I can work with TechForce to make that happen. We have to get the
I like the
schools.
idea.
We got to get the schools to realize that this starts from the federal government. They write the classifications and they put us in transportation. We have to get out of transportation and into engineering as a subcategory of people that make engineers products work.
Hmm.
There's no outsourcing other technology.
Right. And we are, I would say, engineers and mechanics, we're two sides of the same coin. You agree?
I would agree. Yeah.
Engineers can't do anything without, they can build stuff that breaks without us, but they can't keep it running without us.
True.
All right. So our mission, should you decide to join it, I think you've already joined it when you signed up with TechForce, right?
Yeah, I drink the Kool-Aid. I'm there. Yeah.
All right. So we need to make that happen. Um,
Public awareness is what it's all about.
so let's
Yeah.
getting back to your
Out there that this is a good thing, or can be a good thing. The possibility that you may look at this as a career, and I'm telling you, there's going to be definitely people that get involved in this, but they just don't know it's there. They don't know what's available to them. They don't know that it could be a great career for them.
I met some. Yeah, go ahead.
Fairness. It's amazing the light bulbs that go on because they had no idea. So that's 40 people at a time. Where really we need hundreds of thousands of people having light bulbs go on to make fairness.
Like we said before, there's a lot of, I'm that way. I'm not a book smart type of person. I got to be physically hands on and do stuff. So, the idea of doing a job where I have to, be book smart, do tests, that's just not me. I'm, uh, you know, I would have been a trade person growing up. You know, well, actually, that's what I did. I started as a carpenter, working with a carpenter, and then became a sign painter. Always hands-on stuff. But I remember my father telling me, I told him I wanted to be a sign painter. He said, sign? What are you talking about? Well, there's a lot of signs out there. Look around. Somebody's doing them. And he started to look around. He said, yeah, you're right. So he didn't know either, So that's how it is. It's just public education. We got to educate the public. That's it.
Mark, getting back to your high school days, uh, did you have any trouble finding a shop program, or did anybody give you any resistance to tell you that you didn't belong there?
No, actually, I had a lot of support. Even on the family front, my grandfather was a machinist and a mechanic his whole life. So there was never any pushback on it. And my parents were very supportive about um, wanting to make sure that college was there just as an option since it was placed at my footsteps. But they never pushed me to go down that direction. Again, things fell nicely into place for me. I was very blessed in that way. At school, I must admit, from an academic perspective, I kept my grades up on the high school side of things, and there were questions. I could sense that there were questions. Why was I spending my afternoons at a vocational school learning auto mechanics when I was able to keep my grades up the way I was? And likewise at the trade school, quite often, I'm one of those people that I feel comfortable taking those written tests. So it was always a matter of why am I in that particular program. So I mean, I was never pushed against it. However, you could you definitely knew that there were questions about why did I fit in this box as opposed to that one.
Yeah.
Stereotype.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I know people that guidance counselors years ago who'd say, well, you can't do this because, you're not a book smart person. So you're not going to be able to do this career. And it turns out that, yeah, they did do that career that they weren't encouraged not to do.
The problem is the counselors primarily they don't appreciate and understand what this career offers, right? And the skills that it takes to be successful in this career. And I know so many people. It used to be years ago you could fix a car without knowing how to read, but today you can't do that.
Okay.
But those collaterals that from the union, New York City union said if you look at all the books that people need to become a mechanic these days, it's all college level stuff.
Yeah.
So
It changes
why
every
isn't
year.
it
So
changes, right?
Mark, I know you got ASE L1 and L3. I've taken the L1 test. I've given it to high school engineering teachers, and I gave them that test. And I said, "Is this a mechanics test or an engineer's test?" You agree it's an engineer's test.
Yeah, now that you say it out loud, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I love the yellow.
I have to go recertify next week in L1, and I just have to do L3. L3 is the only one I never did yet. So I may call you up for some help, Mark.
Hey, absolutely. Anytime. Love talking about.
Okay. Speaking of talking shop, let's talk a little bit about lubricants. Lubricants is we always talk about the high technology and the electronics in the car, but very rarely do you hear people talk about the high technology of lubricants. So give us a brief education on the technology of lubricants.
All right. So with the lubricants, I mean, on one hand, you could look at it as, hey, it still does its basic job of separating moving parts. It still does its basic job of keeping things cool. I think, in my opinion, the biggest enhancements in the last several years has been the way that the lubricants have allowed new technology to come into play. So, for example, this goes back even longer, but think about lubricant as a hydraulic fluid. So, hydraulic blast adjusters, yeah, I had that for a long time. Then you started using lubricant for like a timing chain tensioner. And now think about lubricants being able to help with the variable valve actuation. And if that lubricant's not just right, the issues that you have with the engine there. And then take it another step and get into some of the GDI vehicles, and the lubricant there is so important to the timing chain. I mean, it continues to take it a step further. I'll give you one more example. You know, engines back again, thinking about the El Camino that I just got rid of. I mean, these are big blocks, lots of horsepower, lots of size. And now you look at engines today, how such smaller engines are putting out the same amount of horsepower, if not substantially more. And now you see piston or oil squirters spraying up on the underside of pistons to allow the higher temperatures to exist and to get you that better lubrication. It keeps going a step further, and it's really amazing to me that the latest thing being these ultra low viscosity oils. You talk to a race team, back 20, 30 years ago, and 20W50 was pretty much the only thing you would ever consider using. And now you've got the racing, in particular drag racing, pro stock level, started bringing that oil viscosity down to the equivalent, if there was such a thing, like a 0W5 weight motor oil. And now you got engines over there, or fleet engines, straight from the manufacturers that are using 0W16 oils. They had to create new categories to help free up that little extra horsepower to help do everything that it needs to do.
At the rate that they're refining the viscosity, are we going to see negative number viscosities?
I think it's not done in its plummet, and I think we're going to continue to see it going down further and further because, again, putting on the engineering hat, there's other ways that you can keep the journal bearings separated from the shafts, and so you don't necessarily have to have that fixed 20W50 there anymore that takes all that extra power to pump through the engine and how fast does it transfer heat. You can get away with these ultra low viscosity oils. Same thing, you think about CVT fluids, even automatic transmission fluids, you're not just making the oil more slippery, you have to control that friction within a very narrow range. You make it too slippery and you've got no torque capacity. You make it not slippery enough and you got harsh shifts and you got customer complaints. I mean, there's really a lot of science that goes in behind the scenes on the lubricants to just to make these different technologies viable today.
One of the things we always stress here is use the right lubricant, generally the OEM transmission fluid or power steering fluid, right? People get into trouble when they use generic fluids.
Yeah, I'm not so concerned about generic fluids as long as they still meet the OE specs. But unfortunately, there's a lot of other fluids, a lot of other chemicals that are advertised on the internet and at some stores that it may be wonderful in one regard, but it absolutely is the worst idea in the other. If I could just go back briefly to that first drag racing example that I had, we were helping this at that point the top flow dragsters were making about 3,000 horsepower. And in their rear differential, we gave them a specialty gear oil, but the crew chief said, hey, this engine oil additive that we put into the engine does, in his opinion, a good job. So we started putting it into the differential. Well, the additives that work for, the flat tappet cams and for the cylinder walls is different from the sulfur gear oil smell that you need on a spiral cut gear and a differential. And so by him pouring in he was pouring in 2 bottles of this aftermarket engine oil additive. It does help reduce wear in an engine, but that additive isn't strong enough to handle the spiral cut gears. It competes for the same metal surface as the stinky sulfur that does have the ability to do its job. So not only was he diluting the effective chemical, but he was adding in a second chemical that has no business being in there, and it was blocking the correct chemical from being able to do its job. And that's why after one pass, they were seeing wear on their differentials in those top fuel dragsters. So, I mean, it may work well in one application, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can use it everywhere and it does a great job.
We get questions here all the time from listeners about additives. The people spend millions of dollars on additives they see advertised on TV and online. Do you have a general rule about additives?
I think the best example comes back to automatic transmission. So I've seen some additives for automatic transmissions where they talk about how it improves fuel economy or how they talk about how it improves wear protection. But again, you come back to those wet clutches, and the friction has to be within a certain specification. And if you've got a additive that works well in a engine to reduce friction, which is a good thing, if you put that in an automatic transmission, then your torque capacity is dropped. So you just can't. It may work well again in one application, but trying to read that over to something else, you have to understand all the implications. And the safest thing, if you're not a lubrication engineer, is to just follow the OE recommendations because they know what will work. Anytime you venture off into a direction, you could end up helping in one area, but you throw something else out of balance. And unfortunately, there are some chemicals, there are some additives out there where I don't think they have any business being on the shelf. So,
And they're probably the ones that make the most money.
that could very well be.
Mark, can I ask you a general question?
Sure.
As Europe and America is climbing out of the pandemic lockdown, lots of consumers have not been using their vehicles.
Mhm.
So here is a question which I hope a lot of our viewers and listeners are going to appreciate. Those consumers who had an oil and filter change a year ago, with fully synthetic oil or semi-synthetic oils, and they've done an ultra low mileage. The vehicle's only done 1,000, maybe 2,000 miles, maybe less, and their indicator light has come on, and it's telling them you now have to get an oil change. What is your view on people who are saying, no, I don't need to have an oil and filter change now. I'll wait till next year because my mileage is so low.
So I hear where you're going, and I agree. Regardless of the fact that you've only put maybe 1 or 2 thousand miles on your car, you still need that oil change. And I'd say that for two reasons. One, most of those oil life indicators, they use different algorithms to try to estimate the oil quality. However, all of the ones that I've read up on have a backup that says no more than 12 months between oil changes. So that oil life percentage may say, 80%, 80%, 80%, and then it comes up on 1 year since the last time the light was reset, and it drops all the way. I would still recommend it just because, one, if you're still under warranty, it's a requirement. But I would also say, just as for my personal car too, I only put on about 2,000 miles during COVID, period. And I just had my oil change. So
What was the time interval on that change?
it had been about 9 months.
Okay.
Yeah. But and I did receive pushback. It's a new car, so I don't do my own oil change. I prefer to take that somewhere just because I'm dealing with the used oil. But anyway, I took it to the dealership because I still have a free oil change, and they pushed back and said, "You've got full synthetic. You're not due for an oil change yet." And instead of challenging them, I said politely, "Well, I believe Chrysler also says, because I drive a Jeep, I said, I believe Chrysler also says that you're supposed to change your oil at 1 year intervals, regardless of mileage." And they said, "Yes, you're correct." And okay, yes, we'll do the free oil change for it.
We all know that synthetic oil is generally recommended 5,000, 7,000 mile intervals, correct?
Correct, yeah.
For synthetic. I couldn't believe it when I went to a Jaguar dealer and they told me on the Jaguar with conventional oil, it was 10,000 miles between oil changes. How can that be?
So anymore, conventional oils, if you were to do a chemical analysis, you're going to see a lot of conventional oils are actually synthetic blends and quite high on the synthetic content, especially if they're one of those 0 W viscosity grades. It just it's difficult to make a 0 W. It's difficult to make a 5 W something motor oil on conventional without using a little bit of synthetic. A lot of oil companies will still include some synthetic, even though it's being sold as a conventional. The other thing is, even the conventional oils, they can go a longer distance or get a longer mileage, similar to what the synthetics do, but the synthetics are unequivocally better typically in their design. So it's not necessarily that you can't go with the Jaguar that you couldn't go that mileage on a conventional. You could, especially if you think that if you remember the manufacturer is doing all of their testing and recommendations on oil specification that's in the owner's manual. So if they say this GF5, GF6 oil can go X number of miles, then As long as it meets that spec, regardless of whether it's conventional, a blend, or full synthetic, it can go that full distance.
Speaking of testing and research and development, I was amazed when I saw how much money oil companies spend on research and development on fluids. Can you give our listeners some idea of the millions or billions of dollars that you see spent on just researching lubricants and fluids?
Well, I can give you a few examples. So, for example, to come out with the next generation engine oil, there's typically, to get that API SN or the ILSAT GF5, GF6, whatever, to get that certification on a final formulation is, the last time I heard, was nearly $500,000 in engine dynamometer testing. So that's just on the final formulation.
That's just on the final testing, nothing on the chemistry side.
Correct. And then you back up. How many trials did you have to run before you get to the point where you're willing to spend $500,000 in one chunk to be able to put that certification on there? And then you think about the larger oil companies, in particular the ones that I had worked for. In addition to doing the chemistry tests, they would also work out arrangements with taxi cab companies and other fleets, and work out arrangements where they could get some actual test miles on a fleet of cars using this oil and tear down the engines and make sure that there's no surprises, there's no unforeseen issue that's not yet part of the API or the LSAC standards that is showing up in their fuel pump. I mean, there's a lot, and that's just for the one formulation. Then you think about all the other formulations that there are. You think about the other, almost everybody's got high mileage engine oils and full synthetic engine oils and value branded engine oils. I mean, diesel engine oils, the transmission fluids, the gear oils. I mean, there's a lot of money that does go into the lubricant testing.
And then people are out there shopping around and looking for the $15 oil change. What can they get in the $15 oil change?
The $15 oil change doesn't bother me so much, because some companies may use it as a way to get you in the door. The thing that makes me more nervous is when you go into a store, a grocery store, or a convenience store, or a hardware store, and you see that bottle of oil that's there that's priced substantially lower than all the other bottles. If you pick that up and you turn it around and you look at the back side of it, some of them actually say not for use in modern vehicles. The front label says motor oil. The backside says API, SA, or SD oils from like several decades ago, and it says do not use in modern vehicles. But people don't read the back label. They see the inexpensive price. They believe it's just a generic form, and they use it in their vehicle, and it can lead to issues.
Speaking of time, people have asked us, what's the shelf life on motor oil or transmission fluid?
A lot of the companies use the terminology of around 3 to 5 years, and it's not so much that the oil necessarily goes bad, but you also have some of the plasticizer that's in the oil bottle. Depending on how it's stored, that plasticizer may leach out of the inside of the bottle container and get into the oil. If the container is then cracked open, then you could have moisture that starts to accumulate. In the dead air space above the oil, you can get moisture in there that eventually, over years, can start to contaminate it. So most places will say 3 to 5 years.
We also have questions from listeners about when they go to get an oil change, they're afraid to go to a place that gets bulk oil from a drum. They want to see it come out of the can.
To each their own. That part, again, that in itself doesn't bother me, but I think you can feel comfortable. If you're comfortable in the shop, you're comfortable that the oil that they have in the drum or in the bulk container in the back is going to be the same quality as the one that you pour in with the bottle. The bottle gives you that final visual confirmation that they're doing what they're supposed to do. But again, if you have trust in the shop, they can get that same product, and anymore, it's so much easier to handle the bulk containers than it is the individual quart containers.
So there's no problem necessarily with a bulk distribution system as long as they're using the right fluid.
Correct. Yeah.
Speaking of the right fluid, we also have a lot of questions from listeners about transmission flushers and power steering flushers.
Sure. All right.
What would you say?
So with a transmission fluid exchange, personally, I think those are a good thing. You do need to be cautious if you've got a transmission that you haven't serviced in, people use numbers from 100,000 miles to 200,000 miles. Some people get nervous if the fluid has never been changed before, and you do a fluid exchange. One of the things that can pop up, it's not a given, but it can pop up, is that the new fluid gets in there and regrettably it does its job very well. And what I mean by that is, you think about like on the wet clutches, when the wet clutch or the band engages, if you were to measure the temperature at the microscopic level where the clutch or the band engage, you could see temperatures of 800 degrees Fahrenheit, even on a passenger vehicle. And that's enough to start to cook the oil. So you can start to have some of that cooked oil in the clutches and the bands on the surface level. But with the previous fluid, you've been driving 100,000 miles, everything's in a nice equilibrium. When you put in the new transmission fluid, you got new detergents and dispersants that do their job and start cleaning. And maybe they start to remove some of that cooked oil from the asperities, the peaks and the valleys on the clutch of the band. And then all of a sudden you got a change in the friction profile. All of a sudden you've got the potential of that clutch or band slipping. And as soon as you get slipping, it generates even so much more heat, and there's other problems that can come. If you keep up with the fluid exchanges, then I believe it's a good thing, again, because the transmission can see those spikes in temperatures even in a passenger car. Regarding power steering fluid, if you had a power steering pump failure or a rack failure or some type of mechanical failure, I'm a firm believer in doing a fluid exchange and getting as much of the oil fluid and any of that wear metal out. As far as if you've got a perfectly sealed system, you have no issues. Personally, I don't see the value in changing the power steering fluid just for the sake of changing the power steering fluid. I would not, if my manufacturer of the vehicle said do it at a certain interval, I would. I'm not aware of any that say that.
Mm-hmm.
But power steering fluid exchanges to me should only be, when it should only be done as part of a pre finishing your repair.
All right. Well, we've all had the discussion here about the debate over when to change transmission fluid. If it hasn't been done in a long time or it's never been done, should you do it or should you not do it? But nobody's ever given us the technical explanation of what happens.
I did a research paper on it, and I posted it on a internet forum some time ago. And I happen to work as well from time to time with one of the OEs that put the stamp of the license endorsement on the back of the transmission models. And they called me up and challenged me and said, hey, if that happens, it's a matter of coincidence. That transmission was going to fail anyway, and it's not because you changed the fluid. It's just coincidence that you did it at that same, just before it happened. And I pushed back and I said, I hear you, that may be correct. However, in the service industry, it's a game of tag. And the customer is going to say, it didn't do that 11 miles ago. You changed the fluid, it's doing it now. I'm not saying not to do it. I'm just saying it's a risk I think you need to have a conversation about ahead of time. You have to be able to accept some of the risk. But at the same time, if a customer comes in and requests a fluid exchange, I think it's extremely prudent to do a test drive first so that you know if there's an underlying issue with the transmission, and they're assuming that a transmission fluid exchange will do the trick.
All right, before we let you go, I want to go back a minute to your early education in shop. Did you ever think what would have happened to you if you didn't have the opportunity to take shop class?
Oh, you know, I actually did, and my father was in the military, and I did reflect back from time to time, and if I wouldn't have gone down this career path, I probably would have gone into the military, which isn't a bad thing. And actually, the only reason I didn't want to follow his footsteps is I had already moved about 2 dozen times, you know, at 3 high schools, 3 colleges for a 4-year degree, and I just wasn't looking forward to that much travel again. But yeah, I look back and wonder how different things could have been, but I have to admit, I am so pleased with the opportunities that I've had, and if 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 somebody would have come to talk to me when I was in high school and said, "Hey, if you enjoy working on cars, you realize that one day you could be working with um, vehicle manufacturers developing new fluids and lubricants. You could be working with NASCAR teams and professional race teams and giving them advice on which lubricants to use and how they can sneak a few more horsepower or avoid one more pit stop." Or if they said you could live overseas as an expat and run an engine and vehicle testing lab, I would have been all in at that time. I mean, it's just a happy series of coincidences, but like again, I feel very blessed and so thankful that I've had the opportunity to take my technical career down one of many paths.
But we always try to tell students and young people that the opportunities in this industry are unlimited.
Mhm.
From mechanics to engineers to test people. There's all kinds of opportunities here, and we really have to stop the schools from discouraging people from taking shop class. Because for many people, it's the only opportunity they have while they're in high school to really excel at something. And for the students that are not good book learners. Uh, this may be their only opportunity. And we've had several guests on who run their own companies today, and they started out in shop class and built their own companies. They're building cars, and they're very successful. And the one guy who builds custom Mustangs that sell for $250,000 and up. Uh, his high school guidance counselor, who tried to keep him at a shop class, now brings his students to the shop to see, what can happen
Yeah,
by starting out in shop class.
that's a great example.
Yeah. And they tried to keep him out of shop class. They tried to keep me out of shop class. We have so many examples of people that we know in the industry that the schools tried to keep us out of shop class. Well, Mark, I want to thank you for coming on with us, and I hope you'll come back soon. I'm sure we all have many more questions we could ask you, but we're just about out of time.
Hey, I've really enjoyed it. Anytime you want to extend the invite, I'm happy to help out.
Well, expect me to be in touch with you regularly about helping students get into the right career path.
Absolutely.
Uh,
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot. I'll be talking to you soon.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank
All
you.
right.